Hi. I'm going to be presenting on behalf, actually 3 papers, and in 10 slides. I thought it was important for a geneticist from our team. This is very much a collaboration with David Anthony, Joseph Lazaridis, Nick Patterson, Alexei Nikitin, and Harold Ringbauer, and others. But I thought it was important for a population genetic analyst on our team to present that part of the work, and David will present the other part of the work. So I'm very glad to be here, and I've met a lot of people I haven't met before, but have worked with, and other people who I've really enjoyed meeting, so it's been a pleasure being here. So I'm going to begin by talking about the data that is presented in the 2 papers that we released last week. It's whole genome genetic data from 372 people, dating from about 6,200 to 2000 BC. The Yamnaya sample size that we have available for analysis quadruples to about a little bit less than 300 people from more than 100 sites. The Neolithic sample size from the relevant region approximately doubles to about 160. And there's a massive increase in Neolithic data from 2 key regions, from the Volga and the Dnipro rivers, which is a particularly rich part of this particular set of studies. And there's key new sampling from the Caucasus, Lower Volga, Neolithic at the sites of Berezhnovka and Remontnoye. That contributes in an important way to the analyses that I'm going to describe. And we co-analyze with almost 1,000 previously published and very important data from the literature. And so this is a joint analysis of this new data, which was selected to address these problems with the previously published literature, which speaks to some of the same problems. So here's the relevant sites that are being analyzed. And I'm not going to talk about every site, but I'm going to highlight first Berezhnovka, which is over here. It's in the lower Volga region. And genetically, it's very, very similar to these sites of Progress 2 and Vonyuchka, which were published a few years ago. And despite being over a very broad region, and in basically the 5th millennium BC. With a little bit more, a lot more Caucasus relatedness, there is the Mycop individuals who have been previously published, and the Caucasus, one of the South Caucasus Neolithic samples from Akhnashin that was published. And then there's this Remontnoye sample, which has an intermediate genetically between these 2, and I'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. The Berezhnovka samples are buried in kurgans with raised knee styles, typical of the north. The Remontnoye samples are also buried in kurgans, but they're on the contracted on the side Mycop style, and we see these influences from south and north across this region. So I'm going to first talk about the first result, which is that this high-resolution sampling in the Neolithic discovers 3 previously unknown pre-Bronze Age clines in the region, which collapse with the formation, with the spread of the Yamnaya and disappear due to the disruption that happens then. But they're extremely informative to see them because it's out of these clines that the Yamnaya and other important phenomena arise. So I'm going to walk you through these 3 clines. The first is the Volga cline. So this is a principal component analysis. I don't have time to explain how it's built. But you see there's gradients of ancient individuals that are sort of shown with these lines, but you can see there's dots forming along this gradient. And one of them we call the Volga cline because it's oriented north-south along the Volga, and with almost complete ordering with respect to the people on the different parts of the river. On one extreme are Eastern hunter-gatherers, who are the hunter-gathering population distributed across a broad region. Then sort of intermediate on the cline are Khmelynsk culture people and also people from Ekaterinovka. And at the end of the cline are these Berezhnovka people in the lower Volga who are similar to the Progress 2 Vonyuchka people in the Caucasus. The second cline is the Dnipro cline. It's on the Dnipro River, and it's a different mixture of local Ukraine Dnipro hunter-gatherers, and to some extent possibly Don hunter-gatherers, such as the Golubaya Krynytsa individual, although we don't have very good sampling along the Don currently. And another axis. So here's the Ukraine hunter-gatherers, and then here are many samples from the Neolithic Sredny culture. And then there are some Yamnaya toward the end of this gradient from the Don, And then most Yamnaya, what we call core Yamnaya, I'll come back to this name and nomenclature, are in this huge cluster of red dots at the end over here, and they are very, very much on this Dnipro-Klein, and it's very possible to show and very clear that they form out of it, that the Yamnaya are late Sredny Sti population. They're directly descended without mixture from Sredny Sti. They formed around 4000 BC, and that the Yamna formed from that. The last Klein that appears is this one, which is probably maybe the most interesting of the three, and we call it the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein, CLV, and it consists of, again, Berezhnovka at one extreme, and then samples at sites like Progress 2 and Vonyuchka, which is almost at Berezhnovka, and some of them are as extreme as Berezhnovka. Then there's Rim-on-Noya, somewhere in the middle, and then there is Maikop almost at the end, and then there's the South Caucasus Neolithic from Akhnashin at the far extreme. So this Klein is very interesting, and I will talk about it some more after the slide switches, which it's sort of slow about doing. So the second result is that this CLV Klein, which persists mostly from 4500 to 3500 BC, throws migrants in all directions in a very dramatic way that creates various phenomena nearby. So here's another depiction. So this is the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein 1. This is the Volga Klein 2. This is the Dnipro Klein 3. So the Berezhnovka end of the Klein mixes with the local eastern hunter-gatherers and creates people at different proportions of ancestry through moving up and down the Volga. That's one process, and that produces people of the Khvalins culture. The Dnipro Klein is a mixture of a different point along the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein, and which is a group that is mixed on one end by this Maikop-like ancestry or Akhnashin-like ancestry and Berezhnovka on the other, but it's not the same source from the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein. So you should think of it as a metapopulation with people with different points along that gradient. They're exchanging genes, but what forms the Dnipro Klein is a different position along that gradient than what forms the Volga Klein. And the Volga Klein is irrelevant to Yamnaya formation. The Khvalins culture is irrelevant to Yamnaya formation. The Yamnaya are unadmixed descendants of Sredny Sti people, and they can be accurately modeled with about 80% ancestry from this Caucasus Lower Volga Klein. It's their main ancestry, 4/5 of their ancestry, and about 20% Ukraine Neolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry. Then there are long-distance westward CLV migrants that bypass intermediate European farmers like Tripilians, and they leave unadmixed CLV people from the Berezhnovka end in Ksongrad in Hungary, and also at Gurguleshti in Moldova. They go all the way across this region, and it's tracking possibly the Balkan-Khvalinsk copper transit. Westward CLV migrants also mixed along the way. They didn't also go through unadmixed. With European farmers, they mixed a little, maybe a few percent, to form Tripilians. We detect this ancestry. And then again with the already mixed Tripilians to form Usatovo, which is half CLV on top of that. And then with other farmers to form Cernavodă 1 and other examples, and there's smaller examples than these three as well. So there's lots of waves of ancestry coming out of this core zone. South of the Caucasus, we find, and this is a major new result, that CLV migrants mixed with Mesopotamian farmers, to contribute to likely Anatolian speakers in the Central Bronze Age sites of Kalahoyuk and Ovarin, which are spread from about 2800 to 1500 BC. And an Ovarin individual actually has a large IBD distant relative segment shared with one of the individuals from Vonyuchka, so it's direct evidence of sharing across this region. So this ancestry was definitely north of the Caucasus. It's not South Caucasus like Akhnashin, and that's because this ancestry brings with it some north of the Caucasus admixture. So this is a hard population replacement of the Central European Bronze Age population. Previous work, the original paper that published this, which was Damgard et al. Science 2018, and our reanalysis in 2022, we didn't detect it, neither paper detected it, and they genetically look similar to their neighbors in a superficial way, but in fact their composition is in detail different, and it looks like a completely different population that's completely discontinuous with the people who were there before, so that instead of being composed of a Copper Age Bronze Age Anatolian substrate, it's actually a mixture of CLV Klein and Mesopotamians, both of which are exogenous ancestry components that are associated with these plausible Anatolian-speaking regions and differ from all their contemporaries nearby, which fit that model of coming from the earlier populations. So these results maybe point to a solution to the problem of geographic homeland of Indo-European languages. So the split of Indo-Anatolian is conventionally dated by many studies, although some people dispute this, to maybe 4,300 to 3,500 BC. Here's 3 references. And the first split is Proto-Indo-Anatolian to the Anatolian languages, like Hittite and Luwian, and classical Proto-Indo-European, leading to, most people agree, but not everybody, all other spoken and some unspoken Indo-European languages. The predominant view is that this expansion of the Yamnaya is what spread classic Proto-Indo-European, and in our model, Yamnaya are 80% Caucasus Lower Volga, so if you think that the Caucasus Lower Volga people spoke an Indo-European language, it makes a fair amount of sense that the Yamnaya might have gotten their language from these people. And then the samples we sample from Kalahuyuk, for example, if you model them with MyCop, for example, are 30% CLV. And so this is a single gradient of ancestry that's contributing both to the south and north. And it's the first genetic evidence, if I'm aware, for a link in the right time between the steppe and the Caucasus. Genetics alone can't resolve whether the languages come from the south, like the Mycop Eknatian-like populations, or the northern Berezhnovka end of the gradient of the CLV Klein. And the solution has to come with synthesis of linguistics and archaeology. There's influences culturally, as I understand it, both from the north, such as these raised Neves burials that we see at sites like Berezhnovka. And there's influences from the south, like sheep and milk. Sabine Reinhold talked about this, Kurgans, and contraction on the side. Gus Krunin, in a paper in 2022, argued that there are serial terms shared across Indo-Anatolian languages, suggesting that Yamnaya formed in a region that used agriculture for its subsistence, and that retained words from the ancestral Proto-Indo-Anatolian languages. And this would add weight to a theory of a southern origin, because agriculture was used in the south, and that the ancestors of the Yamnaya persisting in the Dnipro Valley are westward. That's because the agriculture continued to be used in the Dnipro Valley or westward, and that's consistent with our identification of the Yamnaya's late Srednji from the Dnipro Klein. Okay, so result 4 is that genetics actually provides strong evidence for an eastern route for the expansion of Indo-European languages in Anatolia, which is challenging what's probably the prevailing view of this model. So Alwyn Clockhurst, in this paper in a recent volume, The Indo-European Puzzle Revisited, made a really cogent case for a western route, with the strongest arguments being an entirely western distribution of these circled major branches of Anatolian languages, which split very deeply between 2000 and 3000 BC, according to the estimations. And an argument is that you have if they come in from the west, it's parsimonious to have a simple route dropping off these languages, but if you come from the east, you have to have a convoluted route in order to produce this type of pattern. That's part of the argumentation. But the likely Anatolian speakers from Kalahuyuk and Ovarin, who represent a local population replacement, a hard replacement, and have 10 to 30% CLV ancestry, depending on how you model them, they have none of the European farmer or the Anatolian Chalcolithic Bronze Age ancestry one would have expected them to pick up along this route. And even if you, for the sake of argument, think that they're like Gurguleshti and Xongrad and they just didn't mix with anybody on the way, actually, in these samples from central Anatolia, the major ancestry, 70 to 90% of it, is not local either, and it's Eastern. It's from Mesopotamians. So that, again, points even more strongly to an Eastern route. So how could you get the situation where you have a Western distribution of languages? So a hypothesis that we suggest is that maybe what you're seeing is the impact of the Kura-Araxes expansion around 3000 BC. So the absence of Anatolian languages in the East could maybe be explained by the sort of archaeologically momentous Kura-Araxes expansion, and which we showed in 2022 was again a hard replacement. It completely displaced previously established Chalcolithic northern ancestry that was present at sites like Areni Cave in the region. And maybe it drove a wedge of Hattic or Hurrian speakers, for example, through the Indo-Anatolian speakers, both north and south of the Caucasus, and just erased the previously spoken Anatolian languages in the eastern part of the region. So that could potentially explain the Western distribution. So this doesn't disprove a Western route, but it biases us to it. So for example, I think sort of probabilistically often, and the odds on a Western route before these data, based on the arguments Klockhorst put forward, might be 5 to 1. If you think the genetic data, as I do, are very strong evidence, maybe 25 to 1. In the other direction, maybe you end up with a 1 to 5 odds that it's an Eastern route rather than a Western route, but that it's still plausible for it to be a Western route. Result 5 is that the Yamnaya expansion broke correlations between geography and genetics. So the Srednji ancestors of the Koryamnaya, you can determine when that mixture occurred by seeing the sizes of chunks of CLV and Ukraine Neolithic ancestry in the sampled Koryamnaya, and it dates it very precisely because of the huge sample size to about 4100 to 3900 BC. When this mixture of these components formed, and that's right in the Srednji period when we see the gradient. And so that makes sense that they're direct descendants. And then we also see in our genetic data that there's an intense founding event, a relatively small number of individuals reproducing, just a few thousand in the community, that rocket up. This is a log plot during the Yamnaya period to many tens and even hundreds of thousands of people very rapidly. So you see what's a classic founding event of what might be a clan, perhaps. One could imagine innovating culture and economy that eventually expands with the Yamnaya associated with cultural innovations. So the earliest Koryamnaya we have genetic data for that we can establish is Koryamnaya that experienced this bottleneck that's genetically entirely of the right ancestry components is at Mikhailivka in the lower Dnipro. It dates to about 3600 to 3300 BC radiocarbon, and it's from one of the rare areas with continuous settlement in the Neolithic to early Bronze Age transition. In this region, we suggest very speculatively, not at all, it's not a tight argument, is a candidate for being a place where Yamnaya might have formed. The Yamnaya expanded so quickly that people buried in cemeteries a few hundred kilometers apart are only slightly more closely related to each other than people buried thousands of kilometers apart, and it really just loses correlation to distance in this context. It's very different from patterns seen in other groups. So an invitation is that, like 286 Yamnaya is a lot, but it's insufficient to study relatedness networks, and we have funds actually to sequence thousands of more Yamnaya, and with this type of data, one could actually build up detailed patterns of movement at finer scales and relatedness networks. So if you have ideas or know of samples that could be added to this collection, they probably won't show very many new things about ancestry, but they would identify interesting outliers and might make it possible to learn about these patterns. Result 6, and the final result I wanted to talk about, was that the steppe ancestry in the corded ware was overwhelmingly from the Koryamnaya. This is very clear. It shares the 3600 to 3400 BC founder event that we detect in the Koryamnaya. So I'll shortly walk you through this. This is a result that was in a technical paper, Harold Ringbauer et al., that we published a little bit earlier, but it was a population history result that might have gotten buried in that paper. So this is a plot of the degree of sharing between lots of groups whose names are invisible on the screen because they're too small, but it's from the paper. I understand that the people watching this on YouTube can see this more clearly than the people in the audience. So if it's a bright color, there's a high degree of allele sharing, and this corner down here is Yamnaya, and they're closely related to each other due to the Yamnaya founder event. This is the corded ware. They're closely related to each other, mostly due to the Yamnaya founder event that they inherited. And these are globular amphora. They're closely related to each other due to perhaps their own founder event. So in yellow, this is sharing between corded ware and globular amphora. It's unambiguous evidence, as Martin Sikora also discussed, of the farmer-related source for corded ware being largely globular amphora. And this is relationship between corded ware and Yamnaya, which shows an intense degree of sharing, which traces to the Koryamnaya founder event. So the sharing with Koryamnaya is strongest in the early corded ware, the very group that Papach et al. In this important paper argued might have a non-Yamnaya source. So it is not true that a different population at the beginning of corded ware was the source of their steppe ancestry, and it gradually got replaced with steppe ancestry. It's even stronger at the beginning. So a puzzle is how could descent of steppe ancestry in the corded ware from Koryamnaya be reconciled with the corded ware people not carrying the R1BY chromosome that's overwhelmingly seen in Koryamnaya? So Papach themselves give a possible answer to this, answer whereby waves of Yamnaya women plus waves of globular amphora women keep being imported into corded ware communities and swamped out the original corded ware genome, except on the male lineage where the Y chromosome differed. So an example of this is on this site, which I'm going to mispronounce, Vlinievs, and the green marks in this principal component analysis are samples from this early corded ware site, and you can see that they range on this axis, which is their proportion of steppe ancestry at the top and farmer ancestry at the bottom. And at the extreme, there's people who are genetically entirely Yamnaya-like, and in fact are Koryamnaya, basically, genetically. And at the other extreme are people who are entirely globular amphora farmer-like. And in the middle is where corded ware ends up within a handful of generations, and most people are. What you notice is that the boxes are males and the circles are females, and the females are at both extremes. So all the extremes in females are Yamnaya, all the extreme Yamnaya-related are females, and all the extreme farmers are females, consistent with this model. So a female-mediated spread of steppe ancestry into the corded ware, it differs from the narrative that westward steppe expansions were always mediated by males, which is sort of a naive thing that one might think. And it could explain the lack of sex bias in the westward steppe expansion, or lack of strong evidence of sex bias that, for example, we found when we looked at it in this paper in 2017. But actually, if you think about it, this still could have been a situation of male exploitation, in this case of Yamnaya or globular amphora females by corded ware males in this case, so that you have an initial movement that's Yamnaya mediated, and then a corded ware importation of Yamnaya women, and then a further expansion of corded ware. So that's it. Result one is this high-resolution sampling discovers 3 previously unknown pre-Bronze Age clines. Result two is that this cline, the CLV cline, threw migrants in all directions and impacted neighboring region. Result 3 is that these results suggest a Caucasus Lower Volga origin to the Indo-European Anatolian homeland. Result 4 is that genetics suggests an eastern route into Anatolia. Result 5 is that the Yamnaya expansion broke correlations between geography and genetics, and result 6 is that the steppe ancestry in corded ware people was overwhelmingly from Koryamnaya, and they shared the Koryamnaya characteristic founder event. Thank you.